Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn here again. And tonight I just wanted to do another stream of consciousness blog, and this time I'm going to be discussing the general concept of rights. I was partially inspired to do this upon reviewing one of Dr. Descent's earlier videos where he discusses the concept of rights and the notion of whether they come from government, whether they come from God, or whether they exist at all. And he took something of a George Carlin approach to the topic, which basically stated that rights, if they could exist currently, do not, because we're not extended any rights by the government, and if there are any rights extended by God, they are contingent upon our ability to, I guess, in a synergistic way, to cooperate with them and to be rational in our application of them. And his assertion would be, at this point, we're not doing that, and I would concur with him on that. But I wanted to jump a little more in depth on the general concept of rights and also how they are very often misapplied in arguments. And this is where the other part of the inspiration for this video came from, was a recent encounter with a very unreasonable, let's just say, user who decided to comment on a couple of my videos, and what essentially ensued was about a day and a half of back and forth in purely circular reason. He'd offer a point, and then he would supply a source that I thought was less than credible, and he would say that these are facts and you have only opinions. I, of course, countered by saying something similar and providing my own sources. And the reason why the argument never really progressed anywhere, and why I eventually killed it, because he eventually started to become rude and arrogant, and I simply got tired of listening to his banter, is that we both were coming from different areas, and we were arguing from a point of opinion on something that was basically a matter of fact, and this was issues of history. It is a matter of fact that the Great Depression happened, that FDR actually presided over it, along with Herbert Hoover, and that many things were attempted in order to rectify the issue. And what ensued under both administrations was a lot of quick fixes, or no fixes at all in the case of Herbert Hoover, but no permanent solution to the issue. Even during World War II, there was a level of volatility that was put off to the side when the war machine commenced, and we essentially had a artificially inflated economy due to the advent of the military-industrial complex, which was entirely a creation of the Second World War, which the Second World War in and of itself was largely a creation of bad foreign policy in World War I and the Great Depression. But anyway, to make a long story short, the debate did not end well, because the sources that I provided for my arguments, I essentially gave this user a reading list, much in the same way Ron Paul gave Rudy Giuliani a reading list after that second presidential debate back in 2007, where Giuliani made a complete fool out of himself. And these sources included a few books that were relatively obscure and were written back in the 1930s and 40s during either the height of the Depression or the recent aftermath of it. And other sources which were more readily available, which were not to this individual's liking, because they were of a libertarian perspective. Now, this in and of itself draws up a very interesting question. What is it that actually determines the accuracy of an argument? Is it the facts themselves placed forward in the argument? Is it who is making the argument? Or is it how the facts are actually utilized in the argument? These three choices right here. The person that I was debating with came from this standpoint that if you offer facts, you are automatically right. I would basically contrast myself with that viewpoint by simply stating, we can state facts and not be right in our arguments. I could, for example, state that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and therefore all men are created equal. That is, presenting a fact or something that is true and then using it to argue something else completely. Now, those are two very distantly related, they're not even really related topics. One is an assertion of a mathematical concept, and the other is an assertion of metaphysical ethics, as it were, a construct of ethics drawn from a viewpoint of metaphysics, so to speak. But his arguments essentially came from the standpoint that correlation equals causation. I countered and simply stated that correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it can be, provided on how we analyze the argument itself, how we put forth these arguments and how they conform to what we perceive as reality, which I would argue is reality. I'm not a Kantian. I don't believe that there is a noumenal reality that's underneath the existing one. However, as a believer in the supernatural, I also believe that the natural world is governed by eternal laws that are not automatically known to us. So that's an entire discussion in and of itself. So anyway, this got me to thinking. When we misconstrue or conflate facts with truth, which in essence they're two related though different concepts. One pertains to any number of things that are immediately observable through our senses and knowable by our reason, versus something which is the result of a culmination of the former. Truth is not necessarily the end result of facts. For a lot of people, particularly in modern philosophy, the second concept, truth, either doesn't exist, or it is, even if it does, it is not knowable. Essentially, this is how you get the rampant agnosticism that pervades philosophy today. And I don't subscribe to that viewpoint. I think that truth is knowable, and it's known through a variety of means, be it through rational inquiry, through intuition, or through revelation. And which one of those comes into play essentially varies depending on what the subject is. Subjects of the supernatural, I would argue, are confined entirely to revelation, and where you go to get that is another discussion that I will not get into at this time. But as to the issue of rational inquiry and intuition, these are two equally valid pursuits of what I would call knowable truth within a natural metaphysical context. And others would argue that that is not knowable. We only have facts, and we can only come to a reasonable level of certainty beyond absolute certainty on any given topic. And the problem with is, from this form of skepticism, we can't really have a solid paradigm of where we're coming from based on anything outside of ourselves, and thus all morality and all modes of government become subjective. And this brings me to the crux of the problem with rights. If rights are subjective, do they actually exist? And if we can make them exist through our subjective views, how can we make them consistent? This is where the argument for objective reality and objective ethics comes into play, and thus we come to the concept of rights yet again. Inalienable rights in particular, life, liberty, and property. I do not use pursuit of happiness, even though the Constitution does, because I disagree greatly with Benjamin Franklin, who was the influence on Thomas Jefferson changing that, in that I do not view property as a creature of society. It is essentially the master of society, along with life and liberty. It is not possible to exercise one's liberty without property. And so, yes, this puts me at odds with the U.S. Constitution, and I would support rewriting the Constitution if we ever could, to strike pursuit of happiness from the clause and replace it with property, or to add property in before the pursuit of happiness and have pursuit of happiness be the fourth right laid out in the Declaration of Independence and thus I would incorporate it also into the U.S. Constitution. I'm getting my terms mixed up. The first point I was arguing actually came from the Declaration of Independence, but that was the point I wanted to make there. But now, as to the issue of life, liberty, and property, as it were, we'll treat those as our three, most primary and axiomatic rights. Can we argue, if we accept all three of those rights as paramount, that another subordinate and derivative right, such as freedom of speech, can actually counteract any one of those other three rights? Because this was the point that I got into when I was debating this guy. He was arguing over and over again when I decided to, basically, when he got to the point where he was trolling and I just didn't want to deal with him anymore, I blocked him. And he came back at me with shill accounts and argued basically, you're a censor, I believe in free speech. Now, free speech is fine and dandy. I mean, I believe in it too, but I don't believe that you can use free speech to justify an argument, and I definitely don't believe that your right to free speech basically equals the right to be heard by anybody at any time for any reason. We have laws against disturbing the peace, and we have laws against disorderly conduct, because you cannot run a society with that view of free speech. You can't scream out, "Holy hell, I love this," in the middle of the dead of night and wake everybody up while they're trying to sleep, because that essentially interferes with a person's property rights, because you're invading their privacy within the the sanctuary of their own homes, and you're definitely interfering with their pursuit of happiness, which would consist of a good night's sleep. Now, people can argue on a subjective level whether or not, as an owner of a channel on YouTube, if the YouTube channel equals my property because I did not pay for it, it was freely given to me. But I would argue that until such time as this channel is removed from my control, it is my de facto property. And therefore, just like someone who owns a house, if a door-to-door salesman comes to my door exercising his right to free speech, I can thus exercise my right to slam the door in his face and tell him to go pound sand. I'm not buying whatever it is you're selling. And that's the way I approach dealing with trolls on YouTube. I'm not obligated under any perceived or otherwise imagined right of free speech to listen to anything that you have to say. You have a right not to be shut up by the government if you have some controversial opinion that you want to voice. But I am not the government. I have no way of infringing upon your rights without breaking the law. So, in essence, we don't treat debate in the same way that we treat political discourse. You are free to start your own political party. You're free to call the president a bastard if you want to. I've done it myself several times, both this one and the previous one. But that does not mean that I have to accept every idiotic post that comes onto my channel. And there's a reason why I do delete posts when I think that they're either trollish, or if they're spam, or if they're not actually staying on topic and contributing to the conversation. And it's because over time these posts add up, and I think that text comments are worth reading, and nobody reads them when there's hundreds upon hundreds of them. All right, if you got maybe, let's say, a couple dozen good posts buried under 1,000 comments that are pure garbage, nobody's going to know that you made those posts. So I simply take the initiative and I remove the posts, and people get offended by this, like crazy. It's their small opinions apparently mean the world to them, these people, but they don't mean the world to me, and this is essentially my channel. Now, to be fair, 85% of the comments that I get on this channel are good, and I don't delete them, and I don't normally block people. It's only the occasional riffraff that I do this to, but I have a reason for doing this, and it has to do specifically with my understanding of rights, and that is that you have a right to free speech, but that right to free speech is in turn limited by other rights possessed by other people. We are not islands unto ourselves. We are always in contact with each other, and we're always dealing with each other, and we have to find a medium between the unlimited libertarian rights that all of us seem that we have in and of ourselves. Take from it what you will. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.